The emergency radio cut out at 14:07. 6 American soldiers were bleeding into the sand somewhere past the caravan ridge, and the storm outside had grounded every helicopter within 400 miles. The entire emergency department of Hartwell Medical Center stood frozen. 12 doctors, 7 nurses, 1 military commander with blood on his sleeve, and nobody moved. Then she did. Emily Hartwell, 31 years old, white ER nurse, 3rd shift, hadn't slept in 19 hours. She set down her clipboard, stepped through the crowd, and said 2 words that made half the room laugh out loud. "I'll go." What happened next would tear Hartwell Medical Center apart at the seams, and nobody who was there that day would ever forget what they'd underestimated standing in front of them. If this story has you hooked already, follow along, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm had been building since noon. By 2 o'clock, it had swallowed the eastern road into Fort Della, the military installation 23 miles outside the city of Keswick, and the radar at Hartwell Medical Center's emergency intake showed nothing but brown static where the sky used to be. Nurses taped the supply room windows. The head of facilities had already sent 2 maintenance workers home early. Nobody expected the day to get worse. Then the radio call came in. It wasn't routed through dispatch. It came directly through the hospital's military emergency frequency, a channel most of the staff didn't know existed, patched in through a black receiver bolted to the wall behind the nurses' station that had never once made a sound in Emily Hartwell's 3 years working this department. When it crackled to life at 14:03, the charge nurse, Donna Albright, actually flinched. The voice on the other end was clipped and controlled in the way that meant the person speaking was using every available resource to stay that way. "Hartwell Medical, this is Major Dale Rourke, Fort Della. We have a 6-man team pinned down at grid Kilo 7, 3 confirmed critical, 2 serious. Convoy was hit at 13:40. Storm has grounded all air assets. Road team can't push through. We need a combat-capable medical response. Over." Donna stared at the receiver for 2 full seconds. Then she pressed the call button for Dr. Garrett Voss, Chief of Emergency Medicine, and Dr. Voss was in the department in under a minute, which was impressive given that he'd been in the middle of a patient consult on the 4th floor. He was a tall man, 53, silver-haired, and he had the particular kind of confidence that came from 20 years of people deferring to him without question. He listened to the message replay. He looked at the storm map. He looked at the faces of the medical staff assembled in the corridor outside triage, a reflex gathering, people drawn by the frequency of emergency the way animals sense weather shifts. "We're a civilian hospital," Voss said to Rourke's voice on the radio, as though the voice could hear him. "We don't have the personnel or the authorization to deploy into an active—" "I'm not asking for deployment," Rourke's voice came back, because Donna had pressed the transmit button without looking at Voss. "I'm asking if you have anyone with combat medical training who can ride with my ground team. 4-vehicle convoy. We push through or those men don't make it." Voss took the receiver out of Donna's hand. His expression was patient and final. "Major, I understand the situation. We'll prepare receiving capacity for whatever casualties reach us. We are not in a position to send personnel into the field." He set the receiver down. The room had gone quiet in a particular way. Not silence, exactly, but the specific acoustic flatness that happens when a group of people simultaneously decide to look somewhere other than at each other. Emily had been standing at the medication cart 12 feet away. She had a saline bag in one hand and a patient chart in the other, and she had not moved during any of this exchange. She set both things down carefully. She walked to the nurse's station. "I'll go," she said. "Protect." Nobody laughed immediately. That came a few seconds later, after the pause in which people tried to figure out whether she was serious. Dr. Voss turned to look at her the way someone turns to look at a noise they don't recognize. Emily was not a tall woman. She was 31, with her dark hair pulled back in the kind of practical knot that had nothing to do with aesthetics, wearing standard-issue scrubs and non-slip shoes. She had worked the night shift at Hartwell for 3 years. She was known, generally, as competent and quiet and occasionally difficult. Difficult meaning she sometimes pushed back on physician orders she thought were wrong, which in a hospital like Hartwell was not a quality anyone encouraged. Hartwell. Voss used her last name the way administrators use last names when they want to signal that something is being said for the record. You're an ER nurse. What exactly do you think you're going to do out there? Same thing anyone would do. Keep them alive until they can get here. You've never been in a field environment. She didn't answer that. That was the first odd thing. Not that she said something defensive or over-explaining, but that she simply didn't answer. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked past him toward the radio receiver. Marcus Webb, one of the second-year residents, said something under his breath to the nurse standing next to him. Emily didn't hear the words, but she saw the expression that went with them. She had been seeing variations of that expression for 3 years. Behind her, Donna Albright said quietly, "Emily, I heard the call," Emily said. "I have the training. I'm saying I'll go." Voss crossed his arms. "What training?" "Field trauma. Triage under pressure. 4 access in unstable conditions. Wound packing, tension pneumothorax needle decompression, surgical airway if needed." "Where did you learn that?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "I did a lot of continuing ed." It was a bad lie, and she knew it, and Voss knew it, and the moment had a quality to it that Emily had felt before. The specific sensation of being in a room where the truth was available and nobody wanted it. "You're not going," Voss said. It was not an argument, it was a closeout. "We'll advise Major Rourke on available resources. Everyone back to your stations." He walked away. People moved. The moment dissolved the way these moments always did, into routine and avoidance, and Emily stood alone at the nurse's station for 4 seconds before she picked up her chart and went back to work. She had 4 active patients, a 70-year-old with a UTI that had progressed to early sepsis, manageable now that they'd caught it, a teenager with a broken wrist from a skateboard fall, waiting on ortho, a 45-year-old presenting with chest pain that had so far defied clean categorization, not a clear MY, not a clear panic attack, EKG inconclusive, Emily's gut saying something she couldn't fully articulate, and a woman named Patrice Golding, 62, who came in once a month with complications from poorly managed diabetes, and who had, over 3 years, become something between a familiar face and a person Emily genuinely worried about. She was in Patrice's bay adjusting the insulin drip at 14:31 when Major Dale Rourke walked into the emergency department. He came through the ambulance entrance, not the main doors. He was in uniform, not combat gear, but utility uniform, the kind you wear on a base, which meant he'd driven here directly from Fort Della without stopping. He was 47, heavily built, with a jaw that looked like it had been hit before, and a walk that moved people out of his way without him asking. He had a 3-inch cut on his left forearm that someone had wrapped with field dressing. Roughly, quickly, by someone who knew what they were doing but was in a hurry. He went directly to the nurse's station, and he asked for whoever was in charge. Donna paged Voss. Rourke waited 40 seconds and then stopped waiting. He was looking at the department, not the way patients looked at it, helpless and uncertain, but the way someone conducts a fast assessment. His eyes moved in a pattern, left to right, close to far, faces to equipment. They stopped on Emily. Or rather, they stopped on her wrist. She was walking between Patrice's bay and the medication cart, her left arm extended slightly as she carried a supply tray. On that wrist, half hidden under the cuff of her scrub sleeve, was a bracelet, military-grade paracord, olive drab, with a single metal tag threaded through it. Rourke said, "Hey!" Emily looked up. "You the one who offered to come out?" "Yes." Voss shut it down. "Yes." He studied her for a moment, not the way Voss had. Voss had looked at her like a problem to be categorized and set aside. Rourke looked at her the way people look at something when they're trying to figure out if it matches something else they know. "That bracelet," he said. "That's 75th Ranger support tab." Emily didn't move. "It was a gift." "Uh-huh." He kept his eyes on her. "From who?" "Someone I used to know." "You in the service?" "A beat. Just long enough." "A long time ago," she said. Voss arrived before Rourke could push further. He came in fast and professionally apologetic. the tone of a man who was annoyed at being inconvenienced but was managing it well. He extended a hand. Rourke shook it without warmth. "Major, I understand the severity of your situation, and I want you to know we're fully prepared for incoming casualties. What I need is personnel in the field, not bed capacity. I understand that, and I've already explained to your radio operator that we simply don't have anyone with the appropriate training to—" "What about her?" Rourke said. He didn't gesture. He just looked at Emily. Voss looked at her too, then back at Rourke. "Nurse Hartwell is an emergency department nurse. She has no field experience." "She offered to come." "She offered," Voss said, with the careful patience of someone explaining something to a child who should know better, "because she doesn't fully understand what she'd be walking into. I'm protecting her as much as I'm protecting this department's operational capacity." Emily set her supply tray down on the cart. "With respect," she said, and her voice came out flat and measured in a way that made Donna Albright glance at her from across the station. "That's not your call to make on my behalf." Voss turned to look at her fully. "I'm your department chief." "In this building. What's outside that door is not this building. You are an employee of this hospital, and you will not—" "I'm a licensed emergency nurse, and I am offering my services voluntarily to a military emergency request." She held his gaze. "If Major Rourke wants to accept that offer, there's nothing in my employment contract that prevents me from responding to a civilian military emergency request on my own time." Voss opened his mouth, then closed it. He was not a man who was often caught without a response, and the 4 seconds it took him to find one were loud. "If you walk out of this department," he said, "you will not have a job to come back to." It was the nuclear option. She'd expected it. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought briefly about Patrice Golding and the insulin drip. She thought about the chest pain patient whose EKG still wasn't clean. She thought about 3 years of night shifts and incident reports, and the particular exhaustion of being good at something in a place that had already decided what you were. "Fine," she said. She turned to Donna. "Chest pain patient in Bay 6 needs a repeat EKG in 20 minutes. His troponin levels are borderline, and I don't trust the baseline. Flag Dr. Wentworth if anything changes, not Voss." She pulled her scrub jacket straight. "Patrice's drip is set. Don't let anyone adjust it without running labs first." Donna said nothing, but she nodded once, barely visible. Emily picked up her bag from under the nurse's station. The personal go bag she brought to every shift, the one that was heavier than it looked, and she walked out of the emergency department with Major Rourke without looking back. The convoy was waiting in the ambulance bay. 4 military vehicles, armored transport, a ground team of 8. Not combat soldiers, but support and logistics. The people who kept operations running. They were good at their jobs and visibly unhappy about where those jobs were taking them tonight. The storm outside was a physical thing now. Emily stepped through the sliding doors and the wind hit her like a hand. Sand and grit, 40-mile-an-hour gusts, visibility dropping by the minute. Rourke was beside her. "We pushed to the ridge access road. Ground team confirmed the road's passable, barely. Once we're at the site, you assess. You stabilize whatever you can. We get back here." "What's the injury report?" 3 confirmed critical. Blast trauma from what sounds like an IED. Our team didn't see it coming. Wrong kind of road for that kind of device. 2 more with fragmentation injuries. 1 possible head trauma. 6th man is the team medic. He's functional, but he took shrapnel to the shoulder, and he's been treating the others one-handed for the last hour. Emily processed this. "Do you have blood products in the vehicle?" "O-neg. 2 units. Hemostatic gauze?" "Yes." "Chest seals?" "Should be in the kit." "Should be?" "Will be," he corrected, not apologetically but precisely. "I checked it myself before I came here." She climbed into the second vehicle. One of the soldiers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 23, glanced at her and then away again. Not dismissively, just with the complicated look of someone who had been hoping for more than they got. Emily understood. She always understood. It didn't bother her the way it used to. The convoy pulled out into the storm. Shut. For the first 15 minutes, nobody spoke. The vehicles moved slowly. Visibility was 40 feet in front of them, at best, and the lead driver was navigating by GPS and memory and a certain kind of focused calm that Emily recognized as the professional variety. Outside, the wind hammered the armor plating in irregular waves. Rourke sat across from her. He was looking at his tablet, field communications, running updates from the site. But she could feel him thinking about her in the way that was different from how Voss had thought about her. Less dismissal, more calculation. She used the time to inventory the medical kit that had been stowed in the vehicle. It was better than she'd expected. Not fully stocked, but organized by someone who knew what they were doing. She reorganized it slightly anyway, moving the most likely high-use items to the front. "How long have you been at Harlow?" Rourke asked, without looking up from his tablet. 3 years? Before that? Different hospital. Pendry Regional, out of state. What state? She looked at him. Is this relevant to the mission? He looked up at that. A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. No. Then I'd rather focus. He went back to his tablet. Outside him, a gust hit the vehicle hard enough that the young soldier across from Emily gripped the door handle. The driver didn't react. At the 20-minute mark, the convoy slowed. The lead vehicle had stopped. The radio in the cab crackled. Road damage ahead. Sinkhole on the right side, maybe 6 feet. We can get through, but it'll be slow. Rourke leaned forward. How slow? 5 minutes if we're careful, 10 if we're not. Be careful, Rourke said. They crept through. Emily watched the road through the window and cataloged what the storm had done to it. Erosion channels, displaced gravel, 2 places where the shoulder had simply gone soft and disappeared. The soldiers ahead of them got through. Their vehicle got through. The 4th vehicle hit the sinkhole edge at 14:58 and dropped its right front wheel into soft ground and stopped. Well, it wasn't catastrophic. The vehicle didn't tip, nobody was thrown. But it took 11 minutes to get it out, and in those 11 minutes, the radio from the site came back twice with updates that tightened everyone in the convoy by increments. The team medic's voice was getting shorter. The man with the head trauma was showing pressure signs. Emily sat still and thought through the sequence she'd run when they arrived. She'd been through similar sequences before, in different landscapes, with different variables. She'd been through them in conditions that made this look like a difficult Tuesday. She didn't say this because it wouldn't have helped anyone, and because she'd spent 3 years learning when to stop explaining herself. When the 4th vehicle was finally free and the convoy resumed, Rourke was looking at her again. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't an accusation, more like a fact being filed. "I'm focused," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." "No," she agreed. "They're not." They were 6 minutes from the grid coordinates when the site medic's voice came through the radio with a different pitch. Not panic, which would have meant manageable, but the specific controlled urgency of someone who had run out of manageable. "We're losing the chest trauma. He's dropping pressure. Breath sounds on the right are gone. I don't have what I need to decompress, and I'm out of 5 minutes, Rourke said into the radio. "Hold him 5 minutes. Static. Emily leaned forward toward the driver. "Can you give me 3? The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror, then looked at Rourke. Rourke said, "Drive faster." They reached the site at 15:22. It was the aftermath of a blast. Emily had seen this shape before, knew its geometry before she was fully out of the vehicle. The crater was 8 feet across, 42 inches at the deepest point, black glass at the center where the heat had fused the sand. The vehicles that had been in the convoy were thrown, 1 on its side, 2 with their front ends destroyed. 6 men scattered around a space the size of a living room, some of them moving, some of them very still. The team medic, a stocky man named Delgado whose left arm was wrapped to his body in a makeshift sling, met her at the edge of the site. He took one look at her scrubs, and his face did the thing Voss's face had done. "You're a nurse," he said. "I know," Emily said. "Where's the chest trauma?" Something in her voice made him skip the next 3 things he'd been about to say. "This way," he said. She was already moving. The man on the ground was named Corporal Saya. She caught it from the name tape on his jacket as she dropped beside him. Late 20s, large frame, and the color had gone out of him the way it goes when the pressure is dropping. His breathing was wrong. Shallow on the left, absent on the right, the slight bulge of tension that meant one thing. She had the needle in her bag. She had it in her hand while she was still taking in the picture. She didn't explain what she was doing. She found the second intercostal space by feel, swabbed fast, and decompressed the tension pneumothorax in one motion. The rush of air was audible. Saya's next breath was different, and the one after that. Delgado behind her made a sound she didn't have words for. "Second critical," she said, without turning around. "Walk me through them in order of severity, not order of location." Delgado walked her through them. She moved. For the next 29 minutes, in 40-mile winds and deteriorating visibility, Emily Hartwell worked her way through 6 men. She repacked wounds that had been packed incorrectly, not because Delgado was bad at his job, but because he'd been doing it one-handed with failing supplies. She got 2 IVs in men who were so vasoconstricted from blood loss that their veins were barely visible. She stabilized a femur fracture with what was available, which wasn't much, and she told the soldier holding it together himself, a private named Ochoa, who was biting through his lip to stay conscious, exactly what she needed him to do and how long she needed him to do it. And he did it. She did not hurry. Hurrying and working fast were not the same thing, and she was working very fast. Rourke stood at the edge of what she was doing, and he did not interfere. Occasionally, one of his team moved at her direction. Mostly, he watched. At 15:51, the storm broke enough for a radio call to push through clearly. "Hartwell Medical, this is Rourke Convoy. We have 6 casualties, 4 stabilized for transport, 2 critical but mobile. We are initiating return in 10 minutes. Request full trauma receiving." Harlow's dispatch came back immediately. "Confirmed. Trauma 1 and 2 are ready. Dr. Voss is standing by." Rourke clicked off the radio. He looked at Emily. She was kneeling beside Corporal Saya, checking the seal on the decompression site, not looking up. "You've done this before," Rourke said. It wasn't a question. Emily stood. She stripped her gloves off and looked at the 6 men, 4 of them conscious now, 1 drifting but stable. 1 who'd been unconscious since before she arrived, still unconscious but breathing with bilateral sounds, and a pulse that had climbed from 54 to 71 in the last 20 minutes. "We need to load," she said. "Hartwell." She looked at him. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic, going back through the last hour, recounting things he'd seen, testing them against a hypothesis that was changing shape. "The bracelet," he said. "The 75th support tab. The needle decompression on a tension pneumo without a second's hesitation. The IV access on a patient with no visible veins." He paused. "Continuing education doesn't cover that." Emily held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, toward the vehicles where the soldiers were beginning the careful work of loading the injured. "Let's get them home," she said. Rourke watched her walk toward the vehicles. He picked up his radio. "Delgado," he said quietly, not transmitting, just speaking. Delgado was beside him. His good arm was cradling the immobilized one. He'd barely spoken since the moment she'd dropped beside Saya and run that needle in without breaking stride. "Yeah," Delgado said. "In your experience," Rourke said, "does a civilian nurse move like that?" Delgado was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said, "she doesn't." The convoy loaded up in the thinning storm. Emily climbed into the second vehicle and immediately turned to check Saya's vital signs for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. The young soldier from before, the 23-year-old who'd looked at her with that complicated look when she'd first climbed in, handed her a water bottle without being asked. She took it. Rourke got in last. He said nothing, but before he sat down, he typed something into his tablet, a short message to Fort Della's Intelligence and Records Division, and sent it. The request was simple, 7 words. Run a full background on Emily Hartwell. The convoy moved back toward Keswick, back toward Hartwell Medical Center, where Dr. Garrett Voss was standing by in the trauma bay, and where Emily Hartwell no longer had a job, and where 6 men were going to be alive tomorrow because of something nobody in that building could yet explain. The storm was quieting. The road was bad, and the vehicle was loud, and Emily sat with her hand on Saya's wrist, counting his pulse against the second hand in her head, steady and automatic, the way a person does a thing they have done 10,000 times before. Outside the window, the last of the sand was settling back to earth, and somewhere in a Fort Della server room, a search was running, pulling records from databases that most people didn't know existed, from years that Emily Hartwell had never mentioned to anyone at Hartwell Medical Center, from a version of herself she had packed away carefully and never spoken of again. The results would take 47 minutes to compile. By then, they would be back at the hospital, and nothing that happened next would be simple. The results came back in 43 minutes, not 47. Rourke was still in the vehicle when his tablet lit up. He looked at the notification, then at Emily, who was still counting Saya's pulse against the back of her fingers and hadn't looked up in the last 8 minutes. He opened the file. He read the first page. Then he closed the tablet and sat with it on his knee and said nothing for the remaining 6 minutes of the drive. The convoy pulled into Harlow's ambulance bay at 16:34. The receiving team was ready, or the version of ready that Harlow Medical Center could manage, which was considerable on paper and somewhat less than that in practice. 2 trauma bays had been cleared. Dr. Voss was standing at the bay entrance in a fresh coat, which meant he'd had time to change, which meant he'd been standing there long enough to get impatient and go back to his office and come back again. 3 residents flanked him. A charge nurse Emily didn't recognize was holding a clipboard and looking at the incoming vehicles with an expression of controlled alarm. The doors opened. The soldiers came out on stretchers and on their own feet, depending on their condition, and the Harlow team moved to receive them with the competence of people who were good at their jobs in their particular context. Indoors, equipped, structured. Emily climbed out behind the last stretcher and walked alongside Saya's gurney, her hand checking his pulse one more time as they crossed from the parking bay into the overhead lights of the ambulance entrance. Voss saw her the moment she cleared the doors. His face did something brief and complicated. Surprise, then recalibration. Then the expression that settled over the surprise like a lid. He looked at the soldiers. He looked at Emily. He looked at the state of her. The sand in her hair, the blood on her forearms that wasn't hers, the particular way she was standing that was different from how she stood on shift. Then he looked at Rourke, who had come in behind her. "She needs to be escorted out of this facility," Voss said to Rourke. Not to Emily. To Rourke, as though Emily were a piece of equipment someone had returned damaged. Rourke looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man deciding something. "Later," Rourke said. "This woman was terminated this afternoon." "Major," Emily said, not breaking stride toward the trauma bay where Saya was being transferred to the hospital gurney. "Corporal Saya had a right tension pneumo. I decompressed at the field site. He needs imaging to confirm re-expansion, and his pressure dropped twice in transport. He should be your first priority." The resident nearest the gurney, a young woman named Dr. Tran, whose name badge Emily caught as she passed, was already moving. She'd heard the field decompression, and her hands were going where they needed to go, asking the right questions, which meant she was paying attention to the patient and not to the politics happening 6 feet away. Good, Emily thought. At least one of them. Voss said her name sharply. Hartwell. She stopped, turned around. "You do not have clinical authority in this department," he said. "You are not employed here. You will not direct care of these patients." "I just gave the resident a handoff report," Emily said. "Same thing a paramedic does when they wheel somebody in. I don't need clinical authority for that." "You're not a paramedic." "No, I'm the person who kept them alive for the last 90 minutes. She held his gaze without heat, which was worse than anger would have been, anger he could have met on equal footing. This was something else. "Do you want the full field report or not? Because I have 6 patients, and I can walk you through every one of them in about 4 minutes, and then I'll leave." The receiving team was watching. The soldiers who'd come in on their own feet were standing to one side of the bay entrance, and 2 of them were watching Voss specifically. Rourke had not moved from the spot he'd stopped in. Delgado, one arm in his makeshift sling, had come in behind them, and his eyes were tracking the exchange with the flat attention of a man recording something for future reference. Voss looked around the room. He was not stupid. He understood the audience. "Give Dr. Tran the report," he said. "Then you will leave." Emily nodded once. She turned back to the work. Okay, it took 7 minutes, not 4. Saya's status had shifted in the last stretch of the drive. His pressure had stabilized, which was good, but his oxygen saturation was sitting at 91, and she wanted that noted and addressed within the next 20 minutes, not later. The second critical, a sergeant named Price, who'd taken fragmentation to the abdomen, had been packaged and held, but he needed imaging now, and she said so clearly and then moved on. She went through all 6. She was concise and specific, and she didn't repeat herself. And when she was done, she stepped back from the bay, stripped the borrowed gloves someone had handed her on the way in, and looked for a trash can. Rourke was beside her. "Come with me," he said quietly. "I was told to leave." "You were told to leave by a hospital administrator." His voice had the quality of a door closing. "I'm a ranking military officer in an active emergency response. Walk with me." She looked at him. She was tired in a way that was past the normal kind. The kind that sat in your joints and the backs of your eyes. The kind that came from performing under pressure for an extended period and then stopping. She walked with him. He took her to the family consultation room off the main corridor. Small, deliberately neutral, 2 chairs and a table and a box of tissues nobody touched. He closed the door. He set his tablet on the table face down. He said, "I got your records back." She didn't say anything. "Emily Hartwell," he said, 31. 3 years at Harlow Medical, 1 year before that at Pendry Regional. Licensed emergency nurse, clean record, 2 commendations from Pendry's department chief. He paused. "That's your civilian file." The room was quiet. Outside, through the wall, the muffled sounds of the trauma bay. Voices, equipment, the particular acoustic texture of organized emergency. "The name before that," Rourke said, "took a little more clearance to access. Specialist Emily Hartwell, attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment Support Battalion, deployed twice to Afghanistan, once to an undisclosed location that's still classified. Combat medic, decorated twice. Cited in 3 separate after-action reports for medical interventions under direct fire." He paused again. "Then you left. 6 years ago you separated from service, and 3 months later Emily Hartwell, the combat medic, stopped existing, and Emily Hartwell, the civilian nurse, took her place." Emily sat down. Not dramatically, just because she was tired and there was a chair. "The 75th support tab," she said. "That was my giveaway. That and the needle decompression, and the way you moved at the site." He pulled the chair across from her and sat. "Why didn't you say anything? When Voss shut you down, when they were laughing at you, you had the background to end that conversation in about 30 seconds. She looked at her hands. There was still sand under her nails from the site. "Because it shouldn't have mattered." "It clearly did." "That's a different problem." She looked up. "I offered because I was qualified and the situation called for it. Whether they believed me or not, that wasn't the point. The point was the 6 men at the site." Rourke studied her. He had the look of someone recalibrating a measurement. "Voss tried to fire you," he said, "for volunteering to save those men." "I know." "Does that bother you?" She was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet, not strategic. "Yes," she said. "It does. Not because of the job. I'll find another job. Because 6 men almost didn't get help because he decided what I was before I ever opened my mouth." Rourke nodded slowly, then his radio clicked. He answered it, listened for 15 seconds, and his face changed in a way that made Emily sit up straighter. "Say that again," he said. The voice on the radio said it again. Rourke was on his feet before it finished. Marcet. What had happened was this. The ambush at Kilo 7 had not been random. The Fort Della intelligence officer on duty had been running a parallel track since the IED hit. Standard protocol, trying to determine origin and intent. In the 40 minutes since the convoy had left the site, 3 things had landed in sequence that individually meant little and together meant a great deal. A signals intercept, a flagged vehicle registration near the Caravan Ridge access road, and a communication, fragmentary and partially corrupted, that included the name of a Fort Della supply contractor who had been under preliminary investigation for the past 6 weeks. The contractor's name was Harlow. Not the hospital. A man, Gregor Harlow, 61, no relation to the hospital's founding family despite sharing the name, which was a coincidence that was about to become deeply inconvenient for the hospital's PR department. Gregor Harlow was a logistics subcontractor with 17 years of Fort Della supply work, and apparently a secondary income that the military financial investigators had been quietly circling for the better part of 2 months. This would not have directly involved the hospital, except for one thing. Gregor Harlow's primary office was located in the Harlow Medical Center administrative complex. He leased 2 rooms on the 4th floor through a holding company and had for 11 years, and this arrangement had been approved and was actively maintained by the hospital's director of operations. The hospital's director of operations was a man named Victor Strand. Victor Strand was also the person who had, that morning, before the storm, and before the radio call, and before any of this, signed off on Emily Hartwell's disciplinary file, a 6-month-old document that cited her for insubordination and conduct unbecoming after she had flagged a discrepancy in the hospital's pharmaceutical supply chain and pushed to escalate it above the department level. She had not pushed far enough. The complaint had been absorbed into Strand's office and had not come back out. Rourke learned most of this in the corridor outside the family consultation room in the 2.5 minutes it took his intelligence officer to brief him by radio. Emily heard the relevant parts through the door, which he had not fully closed. She sat in the consultation room and listened to the shape of it assembling itself on the other side of the wall, and she felt the particular cold sensation of a pattern becoming visible after a long time of only seeing pieces. The pharmaceutical supply discrepancy. The disciplinary file. The contractor on the 4th floor. The IED at Kilo 7 that had hit a military logistics convoy, not a combat patrol, not a high-value target operation, but a supply run. The kind of convoy whose route and timing would have been available to someone with access to Fort Della's logistics contracts. She stood up. She opened the door. Rourke was already looking at her. "The pharmaceutical complaint," she said. "I filed it 8 months ago. I reported a supply discrepancy, controlled medications, the numbers weren't matching up between intake and dispensation. I took it to my department head, she bounced it to Strand's office, and I never heard back." Rourke's expression didn't move. "You think it's connected?" "Well, I think someone in this building has been running something through the supply chain for a while, and I think when I started asking questions, someone wanted me to stop." She paused. "Strand signed my disciplinary write-up. I didn't connect it at the time because the stated reason was the inventory complaint, reframed as me being disruptive." "Do you still have the original complaint documentation?" "I have copies. Not here." "Can you get them?" She thought about her apartment, the thumb drive in the kitchen drawer, the printed backup in the folder she'd almost thrown away twice and hadn't. "Yes." Rourke pulled out his radio again, then he stopped. The corridor had changed. 3 hospital security officers were at the far end of it, walking toward them with the deliberate pace of people who had been given a specific task and were following through on it. Behind them, at a distance that suggested coordination rather than coincidence, was Victor Strand. Strand was 55, slim, well-dressed in the way of someone whose primary professional instrument was other people's perception of him. He had a tablet under his arm and an expression of composed authority, and when he saw Emily in the corridor, his eyes registered something that moved too fast for her to categorize. "Nurse Hartwell," Strand said, arriving at a distance of 12 feet and stopping. "I've been informed you've returned to the facility after being formally terminated. I need to ask you to leave." "She's with me," Rourke said. "Major, I appreciate the military's involvement in tonight's emergency, and I understand the stress of the situation. But this is a hospital administration matter. Ms. Hartwell is no longer employed here, and her presence—" "Mr. Strand," Rourke said, and his voice had changed to something Emily hadn't heard from him before. Very even, very deliberate, the voice someone uses when they are being precise because precision is about to matter. "My name is Major Dale Rourke, Fort Della. I am currently the ranking military officer on site during an active response to a military emergency that originated on federal property. Under military emergency protocols, I have authority to restrict movement and secure personnel in this facility until my investigation is complete." He let that settle for exactly 1 second. "I am asking you not to leave this floor." Strand's composure did something small and difficult to read. "I'm not under any obligation." "You're not under arrest," Rourke said. "I'm asking, as a courtesy." The 3 security officers had stopped. They were looking at Rourke the way people look at a situation they've been inserted into without a full briefing, recalibrating their instructions against the new information. Strand looked at them. He looked at Emily. He looked at Rourke. He said, "I'll need to contact our legal representative." "Of course," Rourke said. "You have every right to do that. The fourth-floor office suite, leased through Caravan Holdings LLC to a Mr. Gregor Harlow. Will I find Mr. Harlow there this evening, or—" Strand went very still. It was not a dramatic stillness. It was the stillness of someone who has just heard a name they didn't expect to hear in this context, from this person, and is processing the implications at high speed behind an unchanged face. But the face wasn't entirely unchanged, and Rourke had been watching faces professionally for 20 years. Strand said carefully, "I'm not familiar with the details of every tenant in the administrative wing." "Of course," Rourke said again, in the same even tone. Emily watched Strand's hand tighten on his tablet. Outside, somewhere above them, she heard the distinctive thrum of a helicopter. Not the hospital's medevac, which had a lighter sound. Heavier rotors. Military. Rourke heard it too. He looked up briefly, then back at Strand. "That'll be my commanding officer," Rourke said. "She likes to be present for the interesting parts." The helicopter sound grew louder as it descended toward the roof. Strand's face, finally, showed something unambiguous. It was not guilt. Not yet. Not in any way he'd admit to. But it was the expression of a man who has been standing on ground he thought was solid and has just felt it shift, just slightly, just enough to matter. Emily looked at him and thought about 8 months of being called disruptive, about the disciplinary file, about the write-up that had sat in her record and given Voss the cover he needed to dismiss her tonight without having to explain why. Really, he'd never wanted to hear what she had to say. She thought about Corporal Saya breathing on the gurney because she'd gotten there in time. She thought about how close it had been. The helicopter was on the roof now. Footsteps, multiple sets, purposeful, were coming from the stairwell at the end of the corridor. Strand looked at the stairwell door. Then he looked at his tablet, and Emily caught the motion of his thumb moving toward the screen, fast and deliberate, the movement of someone trying to delete something before the room changed around them. Rourke saw it too. "Mr. Strand," he said sharply, "I need you to put that down." Strand didn't put it down. He hesitated, 1 second, maybe less, and in that second the stairwell door at the end of the corridor opened and 3 people came through it fast. The way people move when they've been briefed on the way up the stairs and don't need to slow down to orient themselves. The woman in front was Lieutenant Colonel Mara Aldis, and Emily knew who she was before Rourke said her name. Not because she'd met her, but because she had the specific bearing of someone accustomed to walking into rooms that were already complicated and making them less so. She was 51, lean, in utility uniform with her silver-streaked hair cut short, and she had 2 personnel behind her who were not security and not medical. They were Fort Della Investigative Unit, which Emily could tell from the way they were dressed and the way they were looking at things. Aldis took in the corridor in about 4 seconds. Rourke, Emily, Strand, the tablet in Strand's hand. "Mr. Strand," she said, "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mara Aldis, Fort Della Command. I need that device secured before you access it further." One of the investigators was already moving. Strand pulled back, not dramatically, just a half step that communicated more than he intended. "This is private hospital property," Strand said. His voice was still controlled but thinner now. "You have no jurisdiction." "I have jurisdiction over any device that may contain communications relevant to a federal investigation into a military logistics interdiction," Aldis said. "Which is what tonight's incident at Kilo 7 is being formally classified as, effective 40 minutes ago." She looked at the investigator. "Secure it." The investigator said, professionally and without hostility, "Sir, I need you to hand that to me." Strand looked at the tablet. He looked at Aldis. He looked, briefly, at the space between them and the far end of the corridor as though doing math that didn't work out. He handed the tablet over. The investigator bagged it, without looking at the screen. Standard protocol. What was on it would be reviewed later, in sequence, with documentation. Aldous looked at Rourke. Something passed between them that wasn't spoken, the shorthand of people who had worked together in compressed situations before. Then she looked at Emily. "You're Hartwell," she said. "Yes." "Rourke's told me." She didn't say what specifically. "The 6 soldiers from Kilo 7, what's the current status?" "4 stable as of 30 minutes ago. Sergeant Price needs abdominal imaging and likely surgery. Fragmentation, the packing is holding, but he shouldn't wait past another hour. Corporal Saya's pneumo was decompressed at the field site. He needs a chest CT to confirm re-expansion, and his SAT was sitting low in transport. The other 4 are serious but not critical, assuming the receiving team followed the handoff correctly." Aldous turned to one of her personnel. "Get someone into that trauma bay and confirm." The person left. Aldous turned back and looked at Emily for a moment longer than a commander usually looks at someone they've just met. "You were terminated today," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. For a pharmaceutical supply complaint you filed 8 months ago." Emily looked at Rourke. He hadn't been idle in the 3 minutes between his radio call and Aldous coming through that door. "That's what I believe, yes," Emily said. Aldous nodded once, the way someone nods when a thing they suspected has been confirmed. Then she looked at Strand. "Mr. Strand," she said, "I'd like you to come with me." "Yeah." They took Strand to the administrative conference room on the 4th floor. Emily was not in that room. She was in the corridor outside the trauma bay, where Dr. Tran was coming out with updated vitals, because Aldis's instinct had been correct, and someone with authority needed to make sure the medical side of this night didn't get lost in the institutional side. Saya's chest CT had confirmed partial re-expansion, which was what Emily had expected. He would need monitoring and possibly an additional intervention, but he was breathing and his pressure was climbing and his color had come back to something recognizable. Price had gone directly into surgery. The imaging had shown a fragmentation piece sitting 4 centimeters from his hepatic artery, and the trauma surgeon, a compact and precise woman named Dr. Veld, who didn't say much but moved with the efficiency of someone who had seen this before, had made the call immediately. Emily leaned against the wall outside the bay and let herself be still for 30 seconds. She was cold in the way that came from adrenaline dropping off. Her hands, when she looked at them, were steadier than she felt. The sand was still in her hair. She'd been awake for over 20 hours. Donna Albright found her at 1740. Donna had worked the Harlow ER for 11 years, and she had the quality of a person who had seen the department through 4 different chiefs and 3 ownership transitions, and had simply continued doing her job through all of it, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided, at some point, that the work mattered more than the politics. She was 53 and tired, and she handed Emily a cup of coffee without being asked and stood beside her against the wall. "Price is in surgery," Emily said. "I heard." Donna looked straight ahead. "Saya? Partial re-expansion, they're watching him. The others? Should be okay." Donna was quiet for a moment. "Voss is on the phone with legal, has been since Aldous arrived." Emily drank the coffee. It was bad, the kind of bad that only hospital coffee achieves, burnt and thin at the same time. And she was grateful for it. "I don't have a job," Emily said. "I know." He meant it, the termination. "Probably." Donna paused. "Emily, that pharmaceutical complaint, the one you filed, did you keep copies?" "Yes." "All of it? The original inventory discrepancy, the chain of escalation, everything?" "Yes." "Donna." She looked at her. "What do you know?" Donna looked at the floor for a moment. When she looked up, she had the expression of someone putting down something they'd been carrying for a while. 3 months after you filed that complaint, I noticed the same discrepancy you'd flagged. Different medications, same pattern. I wrote it up and I gave it to Strand's office because that's what the protocol said to do." She paused. "I never heard back either. And the month after that, my shift assignment got changed. I lost my seniority placement. Not officially disciplinary, just adjusted." Emily set the coffee down. "You should tell Aldous that," she said. "I know." Donna picked at the edge of her badge. "I should have said something 8 months ago, when you filed the first complaint and they buried it. You said something now." Donna looked at her. You could have told Voss what you were when he laughed at you. You could have said who you were and shut him down right there. Why didn't you? Emily thought about this honestly, because Donna deserved honesty. Because I've been trying to be something other than who I was in the Army for 3 years, and I didn't want my past to be the only reason anyone listened to me. She paused, which was stupid under the circumstances. Not stupid, Donna said, just human. The knock on the door that wasn't a knock came at 1812. Emily was in the family consultation room again. Rourke had put her there with a directive to stay available, which was a military way of saying both "we need you" and "don't go anywhere." When the door opened and a man she didn't know came in. He was young, late 20s, in civilian clothes, and he had the look of someone who was trying to appear casual and was not remotely succeeding. He said his name was Kidd, and he was with Fort Della's Financial Crimes Unit, which technically didn't exist under that name, but operated under a designation that meant the same thing. He sat across from her. He had a folder. He was nervous in the way that people are nervous when they're about to ask something they need the answer to and aren't sure they'll get it. "The pharmaceutical complaint you filed in March," he said. "Can you walk me through the specific discrepancy?" "How much do you know?" "Some. I want to hear it from you directly." Emily walked him through it. She was concise. She'd been concise about it when she filed it, and she hadn't gotten more verbose in the intervening months. Controlled medications in the ER supply system, intake logs versus dispensation records, a recurring gap that wasn't explainable by waste or breakage, small enough per unit to miss in a casual audit, but consistent enough across 8 months of records that she'd spent 2 weeks cross-referencing before she put anything on paper. The total volume, extrapolated conservatively, suggested systematic diversion. Someone pulling product out of the supply chain between intake and dispensation and replacing it with something that logged correctly but wasn't what it was supposed to be. Kidd was writing while she talked. He stopped when she said the last part. "The replacement product," he said. "Did you document what it was?" "I documented what the log said it was. I didn't have access to the physical inventory to run a comparison. I flagged the discrepancy and recommended an independent audit. That recommendation went to Strand's office." Kidd looked at his folder. "The contractor we're investigating, Gregor Harlow, his logistics work for Fort Della involved pharmaceutical supply delivery, military-grade controlled medications, the same categories you flagged in your complaint." Emily felt the full shape of it settle into place. It had been forming since the corridor, since Strand's face when Rourke said the name, but now it was complete. "He was running a diversion from both sides," she said. "Military supply coming in, hospital supply going out. This hospital was a distribution point." "We believe so. We've believed so for about 10 weeks. We just didn't have the internal documentation connecting the hospital's supply chain." Kidd looked at her. "Your complaint would have been that documentation." She was quiet for a moment. "Strand killed it." "Yes." "And then filed a disciplinary record against me to discredit any future complaint I might make." "That's our working theory." Emily thought about 8 months. She thought about the night she'd second-guessed herself, the slow erosion of filing a formal complaint and being met with silence, and then being met with a write-up, and starting to wonder, in the exhausted small hours of the third shift, whether she'd made the wrong call, whether the discrepancy was something she'd miscounted, whether the disciplinary note in her file meant she was the problem. She had not been the problem. "I have everything documented," she said. "Original inventory cross-reference, chain of escalation, Strand's office acknowledgement time-stamped, and the write-up that came 43 days after. It's on a thumb drive in my apartment. We're going to need that." "I know." She stood. "I'll get it." "Ms. Hartwell, I can send someone with you, if—" "I live 7 minutes from here," she said. "I'll be back in 20, Tom." She was back in 19. What she found when she came back through the ambulance entrance was different from what she'd left. The 4th floor was sealed. 2 of Aldis's investigators standing at the stairwell door with the specific posture of people who had been told not to let anyone through without clearance. The administrative corridor on the ground floor had Harlow security staff standing against the wall, but they were standing like people who had been told to stay put and not like people who had been told to do anything, which meant their authority had been effectively suspended without anyone saying so directly. Rourke was on his radio near the elevator bank. Donna was at the nurse's station running the ER with the competent calm of someone who had bracketed the institutional catastrophe happening around her and returned to the fundamental task of keeping patients alive, which was admirable and also exactly right. Emily handed the thumb drive to Kid in the family consultation room. He looked at it for a moment, the way people look at small objects that carry large weight. "There's a printed backup too," she said, and handed him the folder. The cross-referenced inventory logs are on pages 4 through 9. The escalation chain is the last 3 pages. I color-coded it, which probably seems excessive, but I had a lot of nights where the documentation was the only thing that felt real. Kid looked at her. He seemed like he was going to say something and then decided against it. He took the folder. She was in the corridor outside the consultation room at 1851 when she heard Voss. He was coming from the direction of his office, moving fast for a man who typically moved as though speed were beneath him, and he had his phone in his hand and he was talking into it in a low, fast voice. He saw Emily and he stopped. The corridor between them was maybe 20 feet long. It felt shorter. Voss said to the phone, "I'll call you back." He lowered it. He had the look of someone who had been running 2 conversations simultaneously for the last 2 hours, one with hospital legal, one inside his own head, and was now standing at the intersection of them. "The soldiers," he said. "Price, how is he?" It was not the conversation Emily expected. She recalibrated. "In surgery. Dr. Veld is on it. He should be okay." Voss nodded. Something moved through his expression. "Saya?" "Monitoring. He's improving." Another nod. He looked at the floor briefly and then back at her, and the next thing he said came out differently. Without the administrative register, without the structure of a department chief speaking to a terminated employee. "I didn't know about Strand," he said. "The pharmaceutical complaint. I knew you'd filed something and that it had gone to his office. I didn't know it went nowhere." Emily looked at him. "Would it have changed anything? If you'd known?" He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. "I don't know," he said, which was more honest than she expected. "I dismissed you tonight because I had a disciplinary file that said you were a problem. I didn't look past that." He paused. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He absorbed that. "The military records, Rourke's told me the basics. Afghanistan, the commendations. That's accurate. You never mentioned it in 3 years." "Well, I didn't think it should be a condition of being taken seriously." Voss was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the hospital kept going. PA announcements, the distant rolling of a supply cart, the sound of the ER managing its evening volume with Donna running it steadily from the center. "The termination," Voss said. "I'll reverse it." Emily looked at him. She weighed it. The offer, the man making it, the complicated reality that an offer made from a position of consequence about to land wasn't the same thing as an offer made freely. "We can talk about that later," she said. "Right now there are patients." Voss looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once and went back the way he came. At 1923, Aldous came down from the 4th floor. She came with Rourke and one of the investigators, and she went directly to the ER nurses' station and asked Donna Albright for a private space. Donna pointed her to the break room, which was empty and which had the advantage of being the one room in the department where people were accustomed to speaking plainly. Emily was asked to join. She sat across from Aldous at the narrow table. Rourke stood to the side, which was his equivalent of sitting. He hadn't fully stopped moving since the convoy, and Emily doubted he would until the night was completely settled. Strand's tablet, Aldous said, contained a communication thread going back 14 months. He's been liaising with Gregor Harlow's operation since before Harlow established the 4th floor office. The hospital's supply chain wasn't peripheral to the operation. It was load-bearing. She paused. Harlow's network was using this facility as a midpoint in a diversion pipeline for military-grade controlled medications. They came in on the Fort Della logistics contracts, got skimmed at intake, and were repackaged and moved out through the hospital's pharmaceutical supply process. Someone on the dispensation end was signing off on inventory that had been substituted. "Who?" Emily asked. "Still establishing that. There are at minimum 3 people in the hospital's supply chain involved. We're working through the documentation. Aldous looked at the thumb drive that Kit had brought in and placed on the table. Your complaint cross-reference accelerates that significantly. The IED at Kilo 7, Emily said. Was that connected to this? Aldous' expression moved carefully. The signal's intercept suggests Harlow's people became aware that Fort Della's financial investigation was narrowing. The convoy that was hit tonight was carrying a manifest that would have shown the full intake discrepancy on the military side. Someone with access to the logistics schedule knew what was on it and knew it reaching its destination was a problem. The room was very quiet. Emily thought about Corporal Saya on the sand, about the shape of the blast site, 8 feet across, 42 inches deep, about Price in surgery right now with a fragment 4 centimeters from his hepatic artery, about the team medic Delgado working one-handed for an hour in a sandstorm because 6 men had been in the wrong place at the wrong time on a supply route that someone had turned into an evidence problem. Harlow ordered the hit, she said. We're not at charges yet, Aldous said, but we're close. Where is he, Harlow? Aldous looked at Rourke. Rourke said, his 4th floor office was empty when we got up there. Building security log shows him leaving at 15:58, about 20 minutes after my convoy called in the casualties, and about 10 minutes after I first radioed the Caravan Holdings connection to my intelligence officer. He paused. He had a window. You're looking for him? Actively. Emily sat with this for a moment. He knew tonight was going to get complicated. He left before we got back. We believe so. His communication thread on Strand's tablet, does that establish where he might go? Aldous looked at her in a way that suggested the same thought had already been developed further than Emily could get to in 30 seconds of reasoning. We have a location, Aldous said. We have a team moving on it. I'm not going to brief you further on that piece. Emily nodded. That was fair. That was, in fact, exactly where the line should be. Rourke looked at his radio. It had been silent for the last 9 minutes, which was a conspicuous silence for a device that had been active constantly since 1403. He said to Aldous, Team 3 is at the Milford Road location. Aldous turned to him. They found the secondary site, Rourke said. Warehouse. Product inventory consistent with diverted pharmaceutical stock. He paused, reading from his screen. And Gregor Harlow is in the building. Aldous stood up. She said to Emily, Stay here. And then to Rourke, Let's go. They left. The door of the break room swung shut behind them. Emily sat alone in the break room for approximately 45 seconds. Then she stood up and went back out to the ER, because Donna was running a department with reduced staff, and 2 of their active patients needed follow-up, and nobody was going to do it while the rest of the building was focused on the 4th floor and a warehouse on Milford Road. She was checking Saya's chart. The nursing staff had let her, without clearing it with anyone, because at some point in the last 2 hours the unofficial consensus of the ER floor had apparently shifted, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Text. 4 words. You should have stopped. She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked up at the ER around her, at Donna managing the bay, at Dr. Trun finishing a consult, at the 2 soldiers who'd come in on their own feet sitting in the waiting area still in uniform, one of them with his arm in a temporary sling and the other scrolling his phone with the 1,000-yard focus of someone who was doing it just to have somewhere to look. She looked back at the message. Unknown number meant a burner, most likely. 4 words meant someone who wanted to rattle her without giving her anything specific enough to hand to Aldous. The question was who sent it. Strand was in a conference room on the 4th floor with investigators. Harlow was in a warehouse on Milford Road with a team moving on him. The supply chain involved at least 3 other hospital personnel who hadn't been identified yet. She thought about the dispensation end. Someone signing off on substituted inventory. Someone who'd been doing it for months and who had just watched the entire structure start to collapse in real time over the course of one afternoon. Someone who was still in this building. Emily forwarded the message to Rourke's number. Then she pocketed her phone and kept her eyes on the ER, looking at every face she could see. Staff she'd worked alongside for 3 years. and trying to figure out which one of them was afraid enough to send 4 words to a number they shouldn't have. She was still looking when the lights went out. Not a flicker. A full cut, every overhead at once, the electronic hum of the department dropping to nothing in a single instant. The backup generators kicked in after a 4-second gap that felt longer, bringing emergency lighting up in orange strips along the floor. And when the ER came back to half illumination, it was different. Monitors rebooting, equipment running self-checks, the mechanical ventilator in Bay 2 cycling through its restart sequence, and the door to the electrical room at the far end of the corridor was standing open. Donna was already on the phone to facilities. Dr. Tran was at the ventilator, handbagging the patient on it, voice calm and completely focused. Emily was looking at the electrical room door. It had been closed 5 minutes ago. She was moving toward it when something caught at the edge of her vision, a shape at the far end of the corridor, near the ambulance entrance, moving too fast and in the wrong direction, away from the emergency rather than toward it, which was the tell that separated someone running from someone running to it. She recognized the shape. She recognized the badge swinging from the lanyard. It was someone she'd handed a patient report to less than an hour ago, someone who'd been standing in the right place to hear everything Emily had said to Dr. Tran in the trauma bay handoff, someone whose name she'd known for 3 years without ever having a reason to think about it. The dispensation coordinator, Milo Graves. He hit the ambulance bay door at a run. Emily was through the ambulance bay door 11 seconds after Graves. The storm had dropped to something that was no longer dangerous but hadn't fully decided to stop. Residual gusts, grit in the air, the parking lot lights swinging slightly on their poles. Graves had a head start, and he was moving fast, cutting left toward the service road that ran along the hospital's east side, which meant he knew the building's geography well enough to avoid the main lot where the military vehicles were still parked. She ran. She was not fresh. 22 hours awake, the field site, the adrenaline cycles of the last 4 hours. And Graves had the advantage of fear, which was its own fuel. But she had the advantage of something else. She'd spent 6 years moving fast in conditions that were worse than this, and her body remembered things her conscious mind had to think about. She closed the gap on the service road. Graves looked back once. He was 41, soft in the way of someone who had spent a decade behind a dispensation desk, and the look on his face when he saw how close she was had nothing controlled about it. It was the raw expression of someone who had been pretending for months and had just run out of room to do it in. He cut right, toward the maintenance building at the lot's edge. Emily pulled out her phone without slowing, hit Rourke's number, and when it went to voicemail said the words fast and flat. Graves, dispensation coordinator. He's running. Service road east side, heading toward the maintenance building. He cut the power. He's your inside man. She pocketed the phone. Graves reached the maintenance building door and yanked on it, and it was locked. And the 3 seconds he spent on that were enough. Emily stopped 6 feet from him. They were both breathing hard. The maintenance building was a solid block of concrete and locked steel, and behind them the hospital's emergency lighting gave the lot a dim orange tint. Graves had his back against the door and his hands out. Not threatening, the opposite, the gesture of someone trying to make themselves smaller. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "Don't," Emily said. "You don't understand how it started. It was one consignment, one time, and then there's a ventilator patient in Bay 2 who was on backup power for 4 seconds because you cut the main circuit," Emily said. "Save the explanation for Aldous." Graves's mouth closed. She could hear running footsteps from the direction of the ambulance entrance. She didn't look away from him. "Were you the one who sent the text?" she asked. He looked at the ground, which was an answer. "How did you have my number?" "Strand's files. He had personnel contacts for everyone who'd filed an HR complaint." His voice was dropping. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. None of this was supposed to go this far." "The soldiers at Kilo 7, Emily said. "Did you know about the convoy hit before it happened?" His face changed in a way she read immediately. Not guilt about the hit specifically, but guilt about what he'd known and when. "I didn't know they were going to... I knew the manifest was a problem for Harlow's schedule. I passed the routing to Strand 3 days ago. I didn't know what he'd do with it." Emily looked at him for a long moment. The footsteps arrived. Two of Aldis's investigators came around the corner of the building and took in the scene, Emily standing, Graves against the door, and moved to either side of him with the practiced ease of people for whom this was a standard configuration. He passed the convoy routing to Strand, Emily said to the near investigator. Get that into the record. The investigator looked at her, then at Graves. Sir, I need you to come with me. Graves didn't resist. He went with the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally put it down in the worst possible place. Emily watched them walk him back toward the hospital entrance. Then she stood alone by the maintenance building for a moment in the diminishing wind and let her heart rate come down from wherever it had been. Her phone buzzed. Rourke. Got your voicemail. Investigators have him? Yes, he said he passed the convoy routing to Strand 3 days ago. Established the timeline on that. It connects the IED directly to the network. Already on it. A pause. You ran him down. He wasn't that fast. You're not supposed to be operational. I was getting some air, she said. A pause that sounded like something that might have been a suppressed reaction. Get back inside, Hartwell. We're not done. The ER, when she returned, was back on full power. Facilities had restored the main circuit in under 8 minutes, which was faster than Emily expected, and spoke well of whoever was on the overnight maintenance rotation. Dr. Tran was at the ventilator patient's bedside, with the expression of someone who had been frightened and was managing the aftermath of it. The patient, an elderly man in for respiratory failure, who had nothing to do with any of this, was stable and had not been compromised by the 4-second gap. Dr. Tran caught Emily's eye across the bay and gave a short nod that communicated several things at once. Donna was at the nurse's station with her arms crossed and her eyes tracking the department in the way she did when she was running a personal assessment of everything simultaneously. Graves, she said when Emily reached the station. Investigators have him. Donna absorbed this. He's been here 9 years. I know. He seemed... She stopped, started again. I processed a controlled medication discrepancy report last year, a small one. I gave it to him to log because that was protocol. Emily looked at her. Tell Kid. Financial crimes, Fort Della. He's in the consultation room. Donna picked up her radio. Emily went to check on Saya. He was in Bay 3, alert now in the particular cautious way of someone who has been unconscious and is still calibrating what's real. The overhead light was on his face, and he looked younger than he had on the ground at Kilo 7, which they always did. The field stripped people to essentials, and the hospital restored the ordinary details. He had a pulse ox on his finger, an IV in his right arm, and a drainage tube that had been placed by the trauma team and was working correctly. He looked at Emily when she came in, and something shifted in his expression. You're the one from the field, he said. Yes. I don't remember most of it. That's normal. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. I remember the needle and someone talking to Ochoa. He paused. Was Ochoa... He's okay, Emily said. All 6 of you are okay. Saya was quiet for a moment. His pulse ox read 94, which was better than 91. What's your name? He asked. Emily Hartwell. You're a soldier? I was. He looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who was still too close to almost dying to bother with social performance. What stopped you from staying in? Emily checked his drainage output on the chart. A lot of things, she said. It was true and it was incomplete, and it was what she had. Do you miss it? She put the chart down. She thought about the honest answer, which was more complicated than the easy one. Sometimes, she said. Not tonight. He looked like he was going to say something else. Then his eyes went to the door behind her. Rourke was there. Tut. Harlow is in custody, Rourke said. He said it in the corridor outside Bay 3, low enough that it didn't carry to the waiting area. Emily had followed him out, and they were standing in the space between bays, the department moving around them. The Milford Road warehouse, she said. He was still there when Team 3 arrived. Didn't try to run. I don't think he believed we had enough to move on him yet. Rourke's expression was flat. He was wrong. What did they find at the warehouse? Pharmaceutical inventory, military-grade controlled medications, fentanyl analogs, ketamine compounds, restricted schedule items, quantity consistent with 18 months of systematic diversion, minimum. He paused. They also found a secondary set of documentation, records of distribution, where the product went after it left this facility. Emily processed this. A distribution network. Broader than just Keswick. We're looking at least 4 cities. This wasn't a local operation. She looked at the bay entrance where Saya's monitors were visible through the glass. The 6 men at Kilo 7 were hit because a logistics manifest would have exposed the diversion on the military intake side. Correct. Harlow ordered people to blow up a supply convoy to protect a drug operation. That's the charge, yes. Among others. Emily was quiet for a moment. The scale of it had a particular weight. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the flat and ugly reality of what people were willing to do to protect something that was, at its core, about money. Strand, she said. Where is he? Still in the conference room on 4. He's asked for legal representation 3 times. The 3rd time, his attorney actually arrived. Rourke's voice carried no particular judgment. He's not talking, but we have the tablet, and we have Graves's statement, and we have your documentation. We don't need him to talk. She nodded. The disciplinary file, Rourke said. The write-up Strand put in your record. We're treating it as retaliatory documentation in the context of the investigation. It'll be formally flagged. Emily looked at him. That's not why I kept the copies. I know. It helps anyway. She looked at the floor for a moment. There was still sand on her shoes from the field site. She hadn't noticed until now. Who else in the hospital? She said. We're working through it. Graves is talking. Strand isn't. Harlow will have lawyers by morning who will make talking into a prolonged process. He paused. But we have the paper trail. The communication threads, your pharmacy cross-reference, Graves's dispensation logs once we pull the originals against his signed-off records. It holds together. It held together 8 months ago, Emily said. When I filed the first complaint. Rourke looked at her. Yes, he said. It did. The acknowledgement was plain, and it didn't come with anything attached to it, and Emily appreciated that more than an apology would have meant. At 2015, Dr. Veld came out of surgery. She found Emily at the nurse's station, and she said, Price is out. Fragment was 3.8 centimeters from the hepatic artery, not 4. I was more careful than I needed to be about the margin, but I'd rather that than the alternative. He's going to recover. Emily said, Thank you. Veld looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who had just spent 90 minutes doing extremely precise work on a stranger's abdomen and was still in the mode of pure function. Rourke told me what you did at the field site, the packing. Delgado did the initial work. He did it one-handed. You redid it with 2. Veld paused. If Price had gotten here with the original packing, I'd have had to work faster and with less margin. The difference was how he arrived. She said it as a fact, not a compliment, which was exactly how Emily wanted it. Veld walked back toward post-op. Donna was beside Emily. She had heard. She said nothing. She just stood there for a moment, in the way of someone who has been worried about something for a long time and is only now beginning to believe it might resolve. Garrett Voss found Emily at 2047. He came to the ER this time not from his office, but from the direction of the administrative wing, which meant he had been on the 4th floor and had seen whatever there was to see there. He looked like a man who had aged unevenly in the last few hours. Some parts of him still composed, other parts carrying a new weight around the eyes and the set of his mouth. He stopped at the edge of the nurse's station. Donna saw him and moved to give them space without making it obvious she was doing so. The termination, Voss said. I've already begun the reversal paperwork. Emily looked at him. You said that earlier. I know. I wanted you to know it's done, not pending. He paused. HR will process it as a retraction. The disciplinary file will be flagged pending the military investigation's formal findings. It won't affect your employment record. The disciplinary file, Emily said. Strand wrote it up because I filed the pharmaceutical complaint, not because of anything I actually did wrong. Yes? The word cost him something. I should have questioned it when it came through. The stated reason, insubordination, didn't match anything I'd observed in your performance. I used it tonight as a reason to sideline you, and I should have looked harder at where it came from. Emily was quiet. I'm not asking you to accept an apology, Voss said. I'm telling you what I did and what I should have done differently, because you're owed that much of a direct statement. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a villain. She had understood that clearly enough. He was a man who had been presented with a document that made his life simpler and had not asked the questions he should have asked. That was a common failure. It was not an innocent one. The chest pain patient from this afternoon, she said. Bay 6, what happened with him? Voss blinked. He was admitted. Wentworth confirmed unstable angina. He's on medication. He's stable. I told Donna to flag Wentworth, not you. She did. Good. Emily picked up the chart she'd been reviewing. I'll be here through the end of the shift. We're short-staffed and there are patients. Voss seemed to understand that the conversation was closed in the only way that mattered. Not finished, but placed where it belonged, which was after the work. He left. The next 2 hours had a different texture. Not calm, exactly, but the post-storm quality of a department finding its footing after something large had moved through it. Military investigators were still on the 4th floor. Rourke was on his radio in the corridor outside administration. Kit had gathered enough documentation to keep his unit working through the night. And the ER ran, because ERs run regardless of what is happening institutionally around them, because people kept arriving with chest pain and lacerations and the ordinary emergencies that didn't pause for federal investigations. Emily worked. She was in Bay 4 with a 12-year-old who had broken her collarbone in a bicycle fall, nothing to do with anything, and was crying in the specific way of someone trying hard not to cry, which was worse, when Delgado appeared in the bay doorway. He had his arm in a proper sling now, dressed by the hospital instead of by himself, and he looked better than he had at the field site, which was not a high bar but was something. He had the expression of someone who had been moving toward a thing for a while and had finally arrived. Emily said to the girl, "One more second," and stepped to the doorway. Delgado said, "I wanted to, and then stopped, which was apparently where his preparation had ended. You worked for an hour in those conditions one-handed, Emily said. They were alive when I got there because of you. The tension pneumo, he said. On Saya. I knew what it was. I didn't have the equipment to... You had what you had. You made the right calls with it." He looked at her. He was not a man who was accustomed to sharing credit in any direction. She could see that in him. And this was landing somewhere uncomfortable and necessary. "Where did you serve?" he asked. 75th Support Battalion. 2 Afghan deployments. "When did you get out?" 6 years ago. He processed this. "And you've been here, in this hospital, as a nurse?" "Yes." "While people like Voss..." He stopped himself. "Sorry, that's not..." "It's fine," she said. "It's accurate." He looked at the floor for a moment. "I heard what happened. The complaint, the write-up, the way they treated you today before Rourke." He shook his head. "You came out anyway. You came out and you did the work anyway." Emily looked at him. "What would you have done?" He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was genuine, and it was the kind of question that didn't need an answer to do its work. "Go get some rest," she said. "Your shoulder needs a proper assessment tomorrow, not an improvised field wrap." He almost smiled. "You're still giving orders." "I'm making a recommendation." He left. Emily went back to the 12-year-old and her broken collarbone. At 22:30, Aldous came back into the ER. She came alone this time. No investigators, no Rourke, just Aldous walking through the department with the particular self-sufficiency of someone who didn't require context or escort. She found Emily in the corridor between bays and matched her pace. "Harlow's attorney arrived 40 minutes ago," she said. "Rourke told me he'd have lawyers by morning." He worked fast. Harlow's representation is experienced at federal cases. They're going to argue the warehouse inventory was part of a licensed pharmaceutical distribution enterprise and that any connection to the convoy incident is speculative. She said it evenly. That's going to be their line, and they'll work it hard. Emily kept walking. How does it hold up against the tablet communications? It doesn't, ultimately. The thread between Strand and Harlow is specific enough about the manifest that it's very difficult to frame as anything other than what it is. But it creates a delay, and delays in cases like this sometimes produce other problems. Witnesses becoming unavailable, documentation chains getting challenged. Emily stopped at the Bay 4 doorway to check on the collarbone girl, who had been moved to a room for the night. The bay was clear. "You're telling me it might not be clean," Emily said. "I'm telling you the legal process is going to take time and is going to be contested. But you have enough." "We have enough to charge," Aldous said. "Charging and convicting are different things. What I can tell you with confidence is that Strand, Harlow, and Graves are not walking out of this without consequence. The weight of documentation makes the structural case solid even if individual elements get challenged." She paused. Strand's cooperation would accelerate things significantly. His attorney is trying to position him for a deal. That process is beginning. Emily started walking again. "And the inside pharmaceutical operation at this hospital? We're pulling the full dispensation records going back 24 months. Graves has identified 2 additional staff members who were part of the sign-off chain. They'll be interviewed overnight. 2 more. People Emily had worked alongside for 3 years, clocking in and clocking out, managing routine, carrying something hidden in the ordinary folds of the working day. "I keep thinking I should have seen it sooner," she said. "You saw it as soon as you had enough data. I saw it 8 months ago. I filed the complaint and it went nowhere, and I accepted that. You escalated it through the appropriate channel. The appropriate channel was compromised. That's not a failure of observation. That's institutional corruption doing what institutional corruption does." Aldous said it without consolation, which was the only way Emily could have heard it. "The complaint is the reason we have a paper trail that predates tonight by 8 months. Without that timestamp, this entire case looks like it started with an IED. With it, it looks like what it actually is, a pattern that someone tried to suppress." Emily thought about this. "Your records were flagged when Rourke pulled your background tonight," Aldous said. "The classified deployment, the commendations. I've seen the full file." "I figured. You separated at specialist rank. The record shows a voluntary early separation rather than advancement track." She let that sit for a moment. "That's unusual for someone with your evaluation marks." Emily looked at the corridor ahead of them. "My team leader was killed on my second deployment, IED, different location, different circumstances. I was there, She stopped. "I had a hard time after that. The Army was good about it. I chose to leave." Aldous was quiet. "I didn't stop being what I was trained to be," Emily said. "I just stopped doing it in uniform." "I know," Aldous said. That was visible tonight. At 23:10, Rourke came into the ER with his radio finally holstered and the look of a man who had resolved enough of the immediate operational requirements that he could exist in a room without tracking 6 things simultaneously. He found Emily at the nurse's station, finishing her documentation of the night's cases. She had been doing it for 40 minutes, working through the field notes she'd made on her phone during transport and the Bay updates from the receiving team, building the record that needed to exist for the medical side of the investigation. He sat in the chair beside the station, not asking, not performing, just sitting, which was what someone does when the urgency is dropped enough to notice that they're tired. Graves gave a full statement, he said, about the convoy routing. He didn't know they were going to hit the convoy. He says he passed the manifest information to Strand because Strand asked for it, and he didn't ask why. He paused. "I believe that's true. It's worse in some ways." "He didn't need to know," Emily said. "He just needed to not ask." "Correct. That's how most of this works." She kept typing. "People don't commit to the whole thing. They commit to each small piece, and they don't look at what the pieces add up to." Rourke said nothing for a moment. "Price is awake," he said. He asked about the nurse from the field. Emily looked up. "I told him you were here. He said to tell you—" Rourke glanced at something on his phone. "Delgado told him what you did at the site. The packing, the IV access, the pneumodecompression. Price said to tell you that he's named his kids in order of how much they cost him, and he's very glad he doesn't have to add another one. Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the screen. There was something in her chest that was not quite manageable, and she let it be there. "How's Ochoa?" she asked. "Femur is going to need a proper surgical fix, but he's stable. He held his own leg together for 40 minutes because you told him to." Rourke shook his head slightly. "Kid's 22 years old. He did well. You told him exactly what to do and why, and you didn't sugarcoat how much it was going to hurt. He said that was the part that helped most, that you didn't pretend." Emily closed the documentation file. She was done. The record was complete, the patients were accounted for, the handoff to the overnight team was in order. She was also, now that there was nothing requiring her to be otherwise, the most exhausted she had been in a long time. At 2344, Aldous convened a brief assembly in the hospital's main conference room on the second floor. It was not a formal proceeding. It was the kind of thing that happens at the end of a long operational night when the key parties are still in the building and certain things need to be said in a room together rather than in corridors or consultation spaces. Present, Aldous and Rourke. Kid from Financial Crimes. Dr. Voss, looking like a man who had spent the last 6 hours revising his self-assessment in real time. Two of Harlow Medical's board members, called in on short notice, who had arrived at 2200 and had been separately briefed. Donna Albright, because Aldous had asked for her specifically, which had surprised Donna visibly. And Emily. Aldous ran through the operational summary concisely. The IED at Kilo 7, the casualties, the field response, the return to Harlow, the identification of the internal network, the arrests. She was factual and quick, and she didn't editorialize. When she got to Emily, she said, "Specialist Hartwell, retired, responded to a military emergency request after the hospital's department chief declined to engage. She provided field medical care that, according to the receiving surgical team, was directly responsible for the survivability of at minimum 2 of the 6 casualties. She also provided the foundational documentation for a pharmaceutical diversion case that our unit has been building for 10 weeks. Without the complaint she filed 8 months ago, tonight's investigation would have started from a significantly weaker position." One of the board members, a woman named Ferris, 60 plus, the kind of board member who took notes in her head rather than on paper, looked at Emily with an expression that Emily couldn't fully read. "The termination this afternoon," Ferris said. "Has it been formally reversed?" "Paperwork is in process," Voss said. "I'd like it completed before we leave this room," Ferris said. It was phrased as a preference. It had the weight of a directive. Voss said, "Of course." Ferris looked at Emily. "Ms. Hartwell, on behalf of the board, and I want to be direct, because I think this situation calls for directness. This hospital failed you in a significant way. The complaint you filed was handled incorrectly, and the consequences of that mishandling could have been catastrophic. I'm sorry for that." Emily looked at her. A board member apologizing directly was a relatively unusual thing. She took it in the spirit it was offered. "Thank you," she said. It was not an acceptance and it was not a rejection. It was an acknowledgement, which was what the moment called for. Tets. The conference room cleared in stages. Kidd left to return to his documentation work. Aldous and Rourke stepped into the corridor for a call. The board members moved to a side conversation with Voss. Donna caught Emily's eye from across the room and gave a short nod. The same nod from the ambulance entrance earlier, but different now. Emily walked to the window. The parking lot below was quieter than it had been. 2 military vehicles remained near the ambulance bay. The storm had fully resolved. The sky outside Keswick was clear in the particular way of post-storm skies, washed out and very dark and full of more stars than the city usually showed. She heard Rourke come back into the room. He stood beside her at the window, not close, just in the same general geography, which was how Rourke occupied space. "Strand's attorney opened a cooperation conversation with our prosecutor 40 minutes ago," he said. "Aldous mentioned he might. He's going to give us the full distribution network, in exchange for..." He paused. "A reduced charging structure, not immunity, reduced." Emily kept her eyes on the parking lot. "Does that bother you?" "The distribution network is worth more than a full charge on Strand specifically," Rourke said. I understand the calculus. It still bothers me a little, yes. She appreciated that answer. The 4 cities in the distribution chain, she said. What happens to those operations now? That's the next phase of the investigation. Strand's information accelerates it significantly, weeks instead of months. He paused. Harlow is not cooperating. He's going to let his lawyers work the warehouse documentation and challenge the tablet communications. It's going to be a longer process for him. But he's not getting out. No, Rourke said flatly. He's not getting out. Below them, one of the military vehicles started its engine. Somewhere in the hospital behind them, a PA announcement called a doctor to a floor they weren't on. Emily thought about the thumb drive in Kid's hands, about the color-coded folder pages she'd made on nights when the documentation was the only thing that felt real, about 8 months of quiet and the specific loneliness of knowing something and not being believed. When you sent the background request, she said, before the convoy reached the field site, you believed me before the records confirmed anything. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You ran a needle decompression in a sandstorm without a second's hesitation on a man you'd never met. The records were a formality. Voss had a disciplinary file. Voss had a piece of paper. He paused. I've worked with a lot of people. There are things you can put on paper and things you can't. Emily looked at the sky above the parking lot. I need to give Aldous one more thing, she said. Something I realized in the consultation room earlier when Kid was asking about the complaint. Rourke turned to look at her. The substituted pharmaceutical inventory, she said. I cross-referenced intake and dispensation logs, but I didn't check a third column, patient outcome records. If they were diverting real medication and replacing it with something that logged identically but wasn't the actual compound. She stopped. Rourke had gone still. Patients, he said. Some of those medications were for pain management. Some were for surgical sedation. If the substitutes were underdosed or inactive, she turned to face him fully. I need Aldous to cross-reference the pharmaceutical diversion timeline against post-surgical complication records for the last 18 months. Rourke said nothing for exactly 2 seconds. Then he had his radio out. Aldous, he said, I need you back in the conference room, now. He looked at Emily while he waited for Aldous to answer. If you're right about this, he said, the charge structure on every single person involved in this operation just got significantly heavier. Emily looked at him. I know, she said. And somewhere in the hospital's medical record system, 18 months of patient files cross-referenced against a pharmaceutical timeline that nobody had yet thought to look at from this angle, the full weight of what had been done in this building was still waiting to be found. Aldous was back in the conference room in 4 minutes. She listened to Emily's reasoning without interrupting. Rourke stood to the side and said nothing because there was nothing to add. Emily laid it out the way she'd laid out the field handoff reports, specific and sequential, without reaching for emphasis the facts didn't need. When Emily finished, Aldous looked at Kid, who had come in behind her. How fast can you cross-reference the pharmaceutical timeline against post-surgical outcomes, she asked. Kid said, I need access to the hospital's records system. Everyone looked at Voss, who had followed the sound of people moving with purpose and was standing in the doorway. Voss said, I'll authorize it myself. He didn't hesitate. Whatever recalibration had been happening in him over the last several hours had settled into something that was less about protecting his position and more about understanding what his position actually required. He pulled out his phone and made the call to the records administrator on overnight duty before he'd even fully left the doorway. Access was granted in 7 minutes. Kid sat down at the conference table with his laptop and the access credentials and began pulling records. The room stayed quiet in the way of people who are waiting for information they don't want to be what they suspect it might be. Emily stood at the window again. She was running the math in her head, not the legal math, which was Aldous's territory, but the medical math. If the diverted medications had been replaced with underdosed compounds, the impact would depend entirely on what the medications were for and what the substitution was. Some cases would show no visible effect. A painkiller running at 60% efficacy produced a patient who reported more pain than expected, got written up as high pain tolerance issues, and went home. But surgical sedation running at inadequate levels produced intraoperative awareness, and certain postoperative medications running light produced complications that looked, in a chart, like normal post-surgical variants. The things that would look like bad luck, like the ordinary uncertainty of medicine. She'd seen charts like that. She had worked in this ER for 3 years, and she had seen charts that gave her a low-grade unease she'd attributed to instinct and filed away. "Hartwell," Kidd said. She turned. He had the expression of someone who has found something and wishes they hadn't. "How many?" Emily said. Kidd looked at his screen. "I need to be careful about characterizing this. I'm doing a first-pass cross-reference, not a full clinical analysis. But in the 18-month window you identified, there are 23 post-surgical cases with documented complications or adverse outcomes that fall within the pharmaceutical categories Graves flagged as diverted." He paused. "Of those, 6 resulted in extended ICU stays. 2 resulted in—" He stopped. "2 resulted in patient deaths," Aldous said, finishing it. She'd been looking at his screen over his shoulder. The room was very quiet. Emily thought about the patients whose charts she'd seen over the last 3 years, the faces she knew from repeat visits, from long nights in the ER, from the ordinary intimacy of caring for strangers in their worst moments. The arithmetic of it, the possibility that somewhere in this building's history there were people who had not gone home because someone had skimmed the supply chain, landed in her chest like something physical. "I need those 2 cases reviewed by a clinical pharmacologist," she said. Her voice was steady. "Tonight, if possible, before anyone makes a public statement about causation, because causation is going to require proper analysis, not a cross-reference." Aldous looked at her. "Agreed. But those cases need to be in the charge documentation regardless," Emily said, "even if the causal link takes time to establish. It has to be in the record now, before the defense attorneys start building their framework." Aldous said, "Kidd, pull everything on those 2 cases. Full patient records, medication logs, prescribing physician notes, the dispensation chain for every pharmaceutical administered during their care." Kidd was already pulling. Voss had sat down at the table. He had his hands folded in front of him, and he was looking at them in a way that Emily recognized, the look of a man running backward through his memory, checking every moment he'd dismissed something, every chart anomaly he'd attributed to complexity rather than cause. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "I signed off on the pharmacy audit last spring, the summary report." He paused. Graves prepared the summary. Aldous made a note. Nobody said anything comforting because there wasn't anything comforting to say. The clinical pharmacologist on call was a woman named Dr. Osai, who lived 12 minutes from the hospital and arrived in 14, which meant she'd been driving faster than the speed limit. She was 50, precise, and when Aldous explained what she was looking at, she absorbed it with the flat attention of someone who had learned over a long career to keep her reactions behind the work until the work was done. She sat down with the 2 case files at 0:23. Emily stayed in the room because Aldous had not asked her to leave and because the medical analysis required someone who could speak the language in both directions, toward the clinical record and toward the investigation. Osei worked through the first case for 22 minutes. She asked 3 questions during that time, all of them specific, all of them to Emily, and Emily answered them without elaboration. At the end of the 22 minutes, Osei said, "The complication pattern in this case is consistent with inadequate sedation management during a procedure that required sustained sedation. The documented medication doses should have been sufficient. If the medication was at reduced concentration, the outcome we see here, intraoperative awareness followed by acute stress response and subsequent cardiac event, becomes significantly more explicable." She paused. "I'm not making a causation determination tonight. I'm saying the pattern is consistent with substitution, and that full toxicological review of the pharmacy records for this patient's care period is warranted as a priority." "The second case," Aldous said. Osei moved to the second file. The second case took longer. It was more complex. A patient whose post-surgical trajectory had involved multiple medications across multiple categories, several of which were in the diverted supply window, and several of which weren't. Osei worked through it methodically and asked no questions this time. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way people look at ceilings when they need to settle something in their mind before they say it out loud. Similar pattern, she said. Different mechanism, same root cause if the substitution hypothesis holds. The pain management complications in this case, the inadequate response that the chart attributes to patient resistance, would map cleanly to underdosed opioid analogs. She closed the file. This patient would have been in significant pain that the clinical team believed was being managed. The room was very still. Emily looked at the two closed files on the table. She thought about the patients whose names were in them. She didn't know if she'd ever encountered them in the ER. The cases were inpatient and surgical, not ER. But she had worked in this building for 3 years, and the building contained them. It had always contained them. This was what Strand had protected. This was what Graves had signed off on, month after month, because Strand had asked him to, and because he had told himself he didn't know what it added up to. "I want these findings in the formal investigative record as of tonight," Emily said. "Not the causation determination. That takes time, and it should take time, but the pattern identification and the clinical correlation. Tonight." Osei looked at her. "I'll write it up." Aldous said, "Thank you, doctor." Then she looked at Emily. "This changes the charge scope significantly." "I know," Emily said. "Harlow's attorneys are going to argue the substitution was never intended to reach patient care, that the diversion model assumed the hospital would compensate through normal clinical adjustment. That argument requires them to prove that nobody in the network knew how the substituted compounds were distributed into patient care," Emily said. "Graves's dispensation logs put the substitution directly into the medication management chain. It doesn't stay clean." Aldous looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained something Emily hadn't seen from her before. Not quite admiration, but the particular regard of someone who is watching another person think with real precision under real pressure. "No," Aldous said. "It doesn't stay clean." The formal arrests were documented and processed through the night. Gregor Hartwell was charged at 1:15 at the Milford Road site. Federal charges, the list of which ran to 11 items and included the IED conspiracy as its most severe count. His attorneys filed immediately for bond and were denied. He was transported to the federal processing facility in Keswick's district courthouse, which was 20 minutes from the hospital, and the photograph taken at intake was the photograph that would appear the following morning in the Keswick Courier's digital edition under a headline that the editor had rewritten 3 times because each draft seemed insufficiently adequate to what had actually happened. Victor Strand accepted his cooperation arrangement at 2:40 and began providing information about the distribution network in the 4 connected cities. His attorney had negotiated skillfully, a reduced charging structure that would likely result in a sentence measured in years rather than decades. This bothered Emily when Rourke told her, and she said so, and Rourke said that the information Strand was providing had already, by 3 o'clock, enabled the initiation of federal investigations in 2 of the 4 cities that would result in the dismantling of operations that had been running longer and broader than anything connected to Hartwell Medical specifically. "The people at the end of those distribution chains," Rourke said, "the end product, where it was going after it left Harlow's warehouse. That's a different operation, and it's been running for 4 years. Emily thought about that for a moment. So this wasn't just about the money from the diversion. The diversion was the supply. What Harlow's network did with it after the secondary distribution, that was where the real revenue was. Rourke's voice had the flat quality of someone reporting facts they find genuinely unpleasant. Military-grade controlled medications hitting street-level markets. You can do the math on the markup. She did the math. She didn't say it out loud. Milo Graves was processed at Hartwell Medical and transferred to custody at 1:50. He had continued talking after his initial statement in the specific compulsive way of someone who had been holding something for a long time, and once the seal was broken, couldn't stop the pressure from releasing. Most of what he said was corroborative. Some of it opened new threads that Kid's team would spend the following weeks pulling. On his way out of the building, through the ambulance bay, he passed 2 of the ER nurses who had worked alongside him for years, and they watched him go without speaking, with the complicated expressions of people who are processing the distance between who they thought someone was and what they actually were. The two additional supply chain staff members Graves had identified were interviewed and suspended pending investigation. Their involvement appeared to be at a lower level than Graves's, but they had signed off on documentation they'd been told was standard procedure, without full knowledge of what the documentation covered. Whether that constituted criminal complicity would be for the investigation to determine. Emily had no strong feeling about it either way. The system had made it easy to not ask questions, and they hadn't asked questions. The consequences of that would be calibrated by people whose job it was to make those calibrations. At 3:20, the ER was running on overnight staffing, and the second shift had absorbed enough of the night's events to have opinions about it, which they kept largely to themselves with the professional discretion of people who understood that opinions about an active federal investigation were best formed after the facts were more fully available. Emily was in the break room. She had a cup of coffee, better than the last one made by a night shift nurse named Paris, who apparently took coffee seriously. And she was sitting at the narrow table, and she was not doing anything, not reviewing charts, not running through sequences, not preparing for the next thing, just sitting, which was harder than any of the rest of it. Donna came in at 3:31. She sat across from Emily and poured her own cup and said nothing for a moment. "Osei's clinical finding," Donna said eventually. "The two patients." "Yes." "One of them. The cardiac event post-surgery. Mrs. Pollard. I remember her." Donna wrapped her hands around her cup. "She came through the ER first. She was nervous about the procedure. I told her the anesthesia team was excellent, and there was nothing to worry about." She paused. "She didn't make it home." Emily looked at her. "I know that's not your fault," Donna said preemptively, because she was a practical woman who understood the architecture of guilt well enough to name it directly. "I know the complete causal chain isn't established yet." "I know." She drank her coffee. "It doesn't make the memory of telling her not to worry any easier to sit with." Emily said, "No, it doesn't." They sat with it together. "You could have left," Donna said after a while. "After they arrested Graves and the investigators had everything. You could have gone home."
"So could you." Donna almost smiled. "I've been here 11 years. I don't really know how to leave before the shift is done." "Neither do I," Emily said. It was truer than it sounded. She'd been trying to leave something for 6 years. Trying to close a door on a version of herself that had been shaped by things most people in this building couldn't imagine. And she'd never fully managed it. What she'd managed instead was to carry it quietly and keep working, and maybe that was the better thing anyway. Maybe the door was always going to be open.
Work found her at 4:15. He came into the break room with the look of someone who had resolved the last of the night's immediate operational requirements and was now in the unfamiliar position of not having the next thing ready. He poured coffee without asking if there was enough. There was enough. He sat across from her in the same chair Donna had used and said, "Aldous wants to speak with you formally in the morning. Official debrief, recorded. She'll want the full account from the field response through to the pharmaceutical identification." "I know." "She's also—" He paused. "She's in contact with the Army's Medical Corps about the service records, the commendations that were in your file. There's a possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility, that the record will be referenced in any formal recognition that comes from tonight's operation." Emily looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means your service didn't stop existing when you left. It means what you were trained as and what you did with it may be formally recognized in the context of tonight's outcome." He was careful about how he said it, not promising, not performing. "I wanted you to know that conversation is happening." Emily was quiet. She thought about the bracelet on her wrist, the paracord and the metal tag, the thing that had given her away to Rourke in the ER corridor, what felt like several days ago and was actually 11 hours. She'd worn it every day for 6 years. Not as a symbol, exactly. More as the kind of weight you carry to remember that certain things were real and happened and made you what you are. "I didn't come back into that field tonight because I wanted recognition," she said. "I know that. I came back because I was qualified and they needed help, and I was standing there.
I know that too. He looked at her steadily. Those things aren't in conflict, Hartwell. Being recognized for something isn't a comment on why you did it. She thought about this honestly, about the years of being looked past and talked over and filed away. About Voss's face when she'd said, "I'll go," and the sound of Marcus Webb's comment under his breath. About the disciplinary file and the 8 months of silence and the particular erosion of being competent in a place that had decided not to see it. It would mean something, she admitted. I'm not going to pretend it wouldn't. Rourke nodded. Good, he said. It should mean something. What? At 6:50 in the morning, with the overnight shift handing off to the first shift, and the Keswick sky going from black to the pale gray that preceded actual light, Aldous held a brief press statement in the hospital's main lobby. She was concise in the way of someone who had decided which facts belonged in public and which belonged in a courtroom. She confirmed the arrest. She confirmed the investigation's scope. She confirmed that 6 military personnel had been recovered and were receiving care, and that the incident at Kilo 7 was being treated as a federal matter. She said that a hospital staff member's previously filed complaint had been instrumental in establishing the evidentiary basis for the investigation, and she named Emily Hartwell. The reporters had questions. Aldous answered 4 of them and then stopped. Emily was not in the lobby. She was in Bay 3, where Corporal Saya was awake, and had been asking the overnight nurse every 40 minutes whether the nurse from the field had gone home yet. When Emily came through the bay door at 6:55, Saya looked at her with the relief of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing and has finally seen it arrive. You're still here, he said. Shift change is at 7, she said. I don't leave before shift change. He looked at her for a moment. His color was good. Genuinely good now. Not the fragile improvement of the previous night, but the real kind. The kind that meant the body had decided to commit. His SAT was 97. His drainage had slowed to the expected rate. They're saying on the news, Yar, he started. Don't read the news yet, Emily said. Your oxygen saturation drops when you're on your phone. He put his phone down. Does it actually? No, she said, but it might. He looked at her for a long moment with the frank gaze he'd had since he woke up, the gaze of someone for whom pretense had been temporarily burned away by proximity to dying. I have a daughter, he said. 8 months old. I've only been home twice since she was born. Emily looked at his chart and said nothing. I'm going to be home for a while now, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Recovery from a tension pneumo and chest procedure. If everything goes as expected, you're looking at 6 to 8 weeks before the Army clears you for return to duty. Your discharge surgeon can give you a specific timeline. 6 weeks, he said. At least. He seemed to be doing something with that number, placing it against something else, turning it over. She's going to be walking before that. Probably, Emily said. I would have missed that, he said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was the plain version of something enormous, the kind of thing people say when they're too close to it to dress it up. Emily put his chart down. She said, You're going to be fine, Corporal. He nodded. He was looking at his hands and then at the window where the Keswick sky was getting lighter by degrees. Thank you, he said. I know that's not enough. It's enough, Emily said, and she meant it without qualification, which was not something she said often, and only when it was true. She left the hospital at 7:12. The morning was cold and clean in the way that follows storms. The air scrubbed down to something simple, the light coming in flat and clear across the parking lot. She had her bag on her shoulder and her keys in her hand, and her hair was still a disaster from the field site, and she was 23 hours into being awake, and she felt, beneath all of that, something she hadn't felt clearly in a long time. Rourke was at the ambulance entrance. He'd been there when she came out, leaning against the wall with his radio finally silent, and she suspected he'd been waiting, but he had the quality of someone who would deny it if asked. Aldis's debrief is at 10, he said. You have about 2.5 hours. I know. You should sleep. I'm going to try, she said, which was true and also honest about its uncertainty. He looked at her for a moment.
For what it's worth, he said, in 20 years, I've been in a lot of situations where I needed to figure out fast whether someone was the real thing. You were the easiest read I've ever had. He paused. Not because of the records. Before the records. She looked at him. Because of the bracelet. Because of the way you looked at Voss when he said you didn't have field experience, he said. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You just waited, like you already knew how it was going to go and you decided to let it go that way. Emily thought about this. I've spent 3 years being patient, she said. What changed tonight? She looked at the morning light on the parking lot, at the spot where the convoy had pulled out into the storm. How many hours ago now? At the ordinary concrete and asphalt of a hospital parking lot in a mid-sized city, which looked like what it was and contained in its recent past everything that had happened. Someone needed help, she said, and I was standing there, and I was tired of letting other people decide whether I was allowed to be what I already was. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Get some sleep, Hartwell. She walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, not dramatically, not falling apart, just sitting in the ordinary silence of a car in the early morning and letting the last 23 hours exist in the space around her without having to do anything about them. She thought about the disciplinary file that would be flagged and amended, about the pharmaceutical complaint that had sat in Strand's office for 8 months and would now be part of a federal evidentiary record, about Corporal Saya and his 8-month-old daughter and 6 weeks of recovery time, about Mrs. Pollard, whose name was in a case file and whose face she hadn't known, but who had come through the ER once and been told by a nurse that the anesthesia team was excellent. She thought about the version of herself she'd been trying to put distance between, the soldier, the medic, the person who had run toward things that other people ran from, and she thought about how that distance had never really accumulated the way she'd hoped, and whether that was a failure or just the truth of what she was. She started the engine. She was not a clean story. She was not a resolved contradiction or a healed wound or a person who had found the right balance between her past and her present and could point to the exact moment it happened. She was a 31-year-old nurse who had spent 6 years trying to be ordinary and had found out in the space of one sandstorm that ordinary was never really available to her, not because of what she'd done, but because of what she carried and how she carried it, and the fact that when it mattered, she could not make herself small enough to stand still. There were people who had looked at her and seen only what she'd told them, and there were 6 soldiers in a hospital behind her who were alive this morning, partly because she'd stopped explaining herself and just moved. She pulled out of the parking lot. The city was waking up around her. Early traffic, the lights coming on in the storefronts along the main road, a woman walking a dog past the intersection. The ordinary infrastructure of a morning that didn't know what the night had been. Keswick doing what cities do, which is continue. She thought about the debrief at 10, about Aldis's formal record and what it would contain, about the board member Ferris's direct apology and Voss's paperwork and the specific bureaucratic processes by which institutions acknowledged that they were wrong, which were slow and imperfect and still mattered. She thought about what came next, which she didn't fully know and which, for the first time in a while, felt less like a question she needed to answer immediately and more like a door that was open. The thing nobody tells you about being dismissed for a long time is that it changes your relationship to your own judgment, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small increments over months, until you find yourself second-guessing the things you know most clearly, filing the complaints that go nowhere, and starting to wonder if that's information about the complaint or about you. It's the kind of erosion that doesn't announce itself. You just wake up one day, and you're quieter than you used to be, and you've stopped expecting to be heard, and you've started calling that maturity. It isn't maturity. It's what happens when you let other people's certainty about what you are replace your own. Emily had spent 3 years in that particular confusion. She'd dressed it up as professionalism and called it keeping her head down and told herself that the work was enough even when the work was being constantly undercut by a structure that had decided, before she arrived, that she was a category rather than a person. And last night she had stepped forward anyway, not because she'd resolved the confusion, not because she'd arrived at some clean sense of herself that made it easy. She'd stepped forward because the alternative
Standing still while 6 people died because nobody in the room wanted to see what was standing in front of them was something she could not make herself do. That was the whole of it. You carry what you are. You use it when it's needed. You don't wait for permission from people who haven't taken the time to understand what they're looking at. She turned onto her street. The morning light was full now, the kind of light that didn't flatter anything but showed everything clearly, the way things are when you take away the drama and leave just the facts of them. A hospital behind her, 6 soldiers recovering, a federal investigation running, a disciplinary file in the process of being corrected. Her name, said aloud by a lieutenant colonel in a lobby full of reporters, connected to the things she'd actually done. She parked. She sat for one more moment. Then Emily Hartwell, 31 years old, ER nurse, former combat medic, a person who had been told in 100 small ways what she was allowed to be, and had finally, irrevocably, stopped listening, got out of the car and went inside to sleep for 2.5 hours before the debrief. She would go back to the hospital today, and the day after that. Not because it was easy, and not because it was fixed, and not because the system that had failed her had become something different overnight, but because the work was real, and the patients were real, and she was finally done making herself smaller than what she was to fit inside other people's expectations of her. She had never been just a nurse. She had been exactly what she was, the whole time. It had just taken one sandstorm for the rest of the room to catch up.